We don't get to decide if and when we become disabled. We do get to decide if that's the language we use to describe ourselves. And for some of us, the moment we're able to say, I'm disabled, makes us feel seen. Welcome, everyone, to the Affirming Practice Podcast. I'm Dr. Casey Ann Brimmer, multiply queer, multiply disabled artist, activist, and educator of more than 20 years.
And I am Pastor Bob Irian. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm a person who tries to be an ally and is very invested in creating communities where people can not just be welcomed, but be actively affirmed and encouraged to thrive.
Feel that. Um, Today's episode is on disability and allyship and challenging ableism. Disability is a complex topic that we can't hope to cover entirely in one episode, but here we are discussing things like the social model of disability versus the medical model, which we've addressed briefly previously, dynamic disabilities, or disabilities which impact people differently day to day, or such as ambulatory wheelchair users or people who can walk but use a wheelchair for various reasons. Euphemisms like differently abled and what is ableism. And we're going to incorporate some of our own experiences navigating disability allyship and disability in general. When we say disabilities, we're talking about multiple things, and that includes chronic illness, communication disorders, developmental hearing, intellectual, learning, mental health, neurological, physical, and vision disabilities. That's a lot of different types of disabilities, and I can speak from my experience, and Bob can speak from his experiences, but we can't speak for other people's experiences. As always, we are just doing our best from our experiences as allies, teachers, and learners. Before we jump in, I want to read a quote that I pulled from this book, Demystifying Disability: What to Know, What to Say, and How to Be an Ally by Emily Ledoux. And the quote is from disability activist Sandy Ho, sorry. And she says disability must be considered within an intersectional framework because it cuts across political, social, and cultural narratives and identities. An intersectional lens challenges the historically white, cisgender, heterosexual understanding of disability to more accurately reflect the narratives as told by lived experiences of disabled people. We've done an episode on intersectionality.
Mhm.
Uh, and this harkens back to that. But disability is the only marginalized or minoritized group that anyone can become a part of at any time in their life. You could be born with a disability or you could develop one over time. Age is a big factor related to disability. And medical conditions and all sorts of things like such as having a fall, getting hit by a car, all sorts of things can make a person disabled. So when we're talking about it from the lens that this is relevant to absolutely every single person, regardless of if they think it is.
Right.
Do you want to respond to that quote at all?
I, I think, the longer I, you know, do this kind of work and think about these kinds of issues, the more I appreciate that concept of intersectionality, because none of us is defined by any one piece of our identity. And the experience of for instance, white disabled males in this country is probably very different from the experience of disabled people of color who happen to be female or non-binary. Um, and so, there's all of these layers of identity that play into one another. And I appreciated really what you said about it's one marginalized community that any one of us can become a part of at any point in our lives. Because in my line of work, I tend to work a lot with people who are older than the median in the population and certainly older than my peer group. And I've watched a lot of people make that progression from what we might consider non-disabled to disabled as just through the effects of aging as they lose their mobility, they lose their hearing, they lose their vision, etc. And it can really create an existential crisis for some people in terms of how they uh, view themselves, how they understand their place in the world.
It really can. There's been a movement in recent years, for example, to have age in place homes,
Mhm.
meaning your home is one level. It's somewhere that you can age in, and if you need a walker or a wheelchair, you can stay in your home. You might need modifications, say two bathrooms, but you can, for the most part, stay in your home, aging in place.
Mhm.
And this is one of those movements that reflects disability in
Mhm.
everyday lives. Go ahead.
And that's also a reality that is very profoundly shaped geographically. So, in the part of the country where I live, and this is where my inner geography geek comes out because that was my undergrad major, like lot sizes and sub or urban housing and suburban housing lots for a long time were narrow but deep, right? So like the frontage on the street was fairly narrow, but the lot itself ran back further because you were taxed by your frontage, how many feet of frontage on the street you had. And it was to the advantage of developers and of homeowners, et cetera, to cram as many houses as you could in as narrow as you could, which meant that houses, in order to achieve a square footage big enough for a family of 4, 5, 6, 7 people, went up, right? So every house had a basement, a first floor, and probably a second floor. I grew up in a part of the country where, first of all, nobody had a basement. I didn't know anybody who had a basement. And most of the people that I knew, we all grew up in one-story houses because the land use patterns developed differently. I grew up in Texas where, everything's bigger in Texas, including the lots, and you weren't taxed in the same way. And so there wasn't that incentive to build houses in a certain pattern, which meant, like, for instance, my parents' house, when they built their house 40 years ago, they weren't thinking about it being an age in place house, but it has become an age in place house for them simply by virtue of the fact that everything's on one level and there was a minimal, like, 2.5, 3 inch step from the front porch into the house that they could very easily accommodate with a very minimal ramp when my mother's mobility became a problem. So here again, this is an experience that is not only different for people based on other aspects of their identity, and like so many things is different based on people's, socioeconomic status, et cetera. It can also be a very different experience based just on your geography. Where in the country are you located, and what is the housing stock like?
Yeah. So I'm actually going to move one of our later points up because of the natural progression of this conversation and talk about social determinants of health really quickly. So, social determinant of health is any social factor, age, gender, sexual orientation, race, class, that determines access to care and, in the case of disability, access to accommodations. and socioeconomic class being a barrier to care. So if you don't have enough money to go to a doctor regularly, to get checkups, to get something checked out, being a barrier to medical care is therefore a barrier to diagnoses. And you often need a diagnosis to gain access to accommodations. In this way, a lot of disability accommodations are privileges, and not everyone has access to them because not everyone has access to quality doctors who will listen to them. And
Mhm.
things like Black maternal mortality rates, things like if you are queer and you're actively avoiding doctors who misgender you. There's so many ways that social determinants of health play a role in our lives and in disability. But like you said, where we live, our so like our literal physical location can play a role in our access to care. Think about it. If you live in a very rural area and there aren't many doctors, if you live in a very rural area and the closest medical center requires a life flight, which costs 10, 20 plus $1,000, are you going to avoid that life flight if you are critically injured? Do you have a choice?
I've I've experienced that exact situation when I was a hospital chaplain uh, with an Amish family who their child had a head injury due to a fall at home, and they were the child was brought to the hospital where I was working, which we had a trauma neuro unit, but we were not a children's hospital. And the feeling was that this child would be best cared for at the regional children's hospital an hour up the road. And the trauma surgeon said, we need to put your child on a helicopter and fly them up there right now. And this family really had to wrestle with that decision. And the doctor was sort of irate because why do they even need to think about this? This is crazy. You know, what is there to think about? Give me the authorization so I can put your kid on the helicopter. And fortunately, he did not say this to the family, but he was saying this to me. And I said, Doc, you got to understand, you and I have health insurance. This is a community that does not believe in insurance. So they're having to balance, do they bankrupt their family and put the rest of their children at risk versus, for the difference between a helicopter flight versus an ambulance ride? They're not debating whether or not to send their kids to get the best possible care. They're debating among themselves, how do we do this? And, in the end, they made the decision, call the helicopter and whatever. But certainly people get put into those positions. I've served calls in rural areas where not only were clergy like the mental health first aid, which is a big part of what we do, in some cases, we were the closest thing to a mental health practitioner within 40 miles.
Yeah.
In my first call, the only mental health provider, the nearest mental health provider who was accepting new patients was 65 miles away. And so it was not surprising that a lot of folks were not getting mental health care for things that could have really improved their quality of life.
Definitely. I also think about things like when I first got diagnosed as being hypermobile, the doctor looked at me and genuinely told me that there was a treatment I could do. I can't remember what it was called. It was some sort of injection into my joints to create scar tissue to intentionally try to stabilize my joints in that way. And he said, insurance doesn't cover this. You should consider crowdfunding it. For a doctor to tell a patient, crowdfund this,
Mm-hmm.
it says a whole lot about our medical complex here in the US. And at that point, I think I paid like a third of my income to medical and pharmaceutical copays as a grad student. And that I was like, I don't know where you want me to crowdfund because, uh, no. Not everyone has that kind of community.
Hmm.
Um, but there are so many factors in social determinants of health. If we look at, for example, people assigned female at birth who are neurodivergent but can't get the diagnosis because they can't get the evaluation because there are still people who believe that people assigned female at birth cannot be autistic, cannot be ADHD. Or people of color not getting diagnosed as ADHD when they are ADHD, but getting diagnosed with things like oppositional defiance disorder, which has a different stigma attached. And it determines what accommodations you can get and what spaces that certain institutions will kind of let you be in.
Hmm.
And it is absurd the barriers to health that people face just based off of who they are. And when we face barriers to health in various ways, we increase risk of disability. But I want to throw out there that these lovely glasses I'm wearing are a disability accommodation.
Hmm.
Not just because I cannot see my computer screen without them and I'm only 2 feet away, but because mine specifically are tinted rose. This is a lighter tint than I used to have um, to help treat my brain injury and to help treat my ADHD, actually. I used to have medical tape on my glasses as like a life hack because I couldn't afford fancy glasses. So I put medical tape on my glasses per order of my doctor to help treat my brain injury.
Mm.
And it drove me absolutely absurd. So like I worked them off my glasses because I didn't like how they looked and I felt like I was being judged for having them on my glasses and all this other stuff. And so we also have to look at, do we use our accommodations when we have our accommodations because people are judging us,
Hmm.
because we can't actually afford the accommodation we need, so we had to life hack it, or um, because we're being pressured not to.
Hmm.
Do you have anything you want to throw in?
Just, as you said, oftentimes the accommodations themselves are things that people will shy away from for a lot of reasons. And the other thing is, the barriers to diagnosis can come in all sorts of ways too. One of the things that I personally experienced when I was trying to even get screened for ADHD, because there were people close to me who said, "You really, really need to get screened for ADHD." And I'm like, well, okay, if you say so. I literally had a psychiatrist who should know better tell me, "Oh, you can't possibly have ADHD. You're in your 40s and you have a master's degree."
I didn't get diagnosed until I was in the middle of my PhD, and I did two masters and a bachelor's. So, like,
Right, yeah, and certainly it's been very interesting for me as someone who has been through a very significant weight loss. I used to weigh about 110 pounds more than I do now. The difference in how I am received by physicians and others in the medical profession weighing 220 pounds versus when I weighed 330 pounds is very different. I can walk into a doctor's office with the exact same issue, the exact same complaint, and be taken far more seriously now than I was then, because at that point the answer was always, well, you just need to eat right, exercise more, and lose some weight.
okay.
Like I could have walked in like hemorrhaging from, a
Yeah.
massive laceration in my forearm, and the first thing they would have said to me was, "Well, you just need to, eat right, exercise more, and lose some weight."
So, I've told some of the stories, like, on this podcast, like, my jaw was dislocating because I was fat. And that's not how bodies work. But also, I was considering top surgery at one point, and I was referred to a physician in Southwest Virginia who looked at me and said, "Your BMI is too high. I can't do the surgery until you lose," and it was like 200 pounds. And I was like, there's a lot of barriers to that. And BMI is not an accurate indicator of health. And he argued with me about BMI being an accurate indicator of health. And then he says, you just need to eat less. But because of other disabilities, I already hadn't eaten in like 2 or 3 days. You can't eat less than nothing.
Hmm.
And doctors not taking things like that into account.
Hmm.
It says a lot about what they aren't taught that they need to be taught.
Yes.
Uh, Another kind of example is I just recently did a presentation for physical therapy students in the doctor of physical therapy program in their like kind of social issues in this field class for their introductory semester. And there were people online who were mad at me for doing this presentation because what does gender or sexuality, what do LGBT identities have to do with physical therapy? And I was like, let me list some things. And so there are factors to consider with all kinds of identities in relation to the medical field, in relation to medical experiences and experiences with disability, including whether or not we call ourselves disabled. I spoke recently in an episode about the first time I called myself disabled and feeling like, oh crap, I have a community. I don't have to do this alone. And yet, when I call myself disabled around certain people, they're like, well, you're not disabled, you can walk. Well, disabilities look like a lot of things, and no, I can't always walk. Um, and so having there are different ways people can be disabled. I listed off a bunch of them at the start of this episode, and that's not always taken into consideration.
Hmm.
It's also to move us along a little bit. There are at least two models of disability. One is the medical model, which says our disabilities are determined by our diagnoses or symptoms and mitigated by treatment of those diagnoses or symptoms. Again, diagnoses are a privilege that comes with access to healthcare. And even then, they are often unavailable to those assigned female at birth, are queer, have complex health concerns, are a person of color, etc. And not all disabilities come with diagnoses. I still have things that I have not had properly diagnosed because there aren't providers who feel comfortable doing the diagnosing, even though they're like, well, I'm pretty sure you have this, but I don't feel comfortable being the one who gives you that diagnosis. For those who don't know, Bob just narrowed his eyes and scrunched his face a little bit. Um, so I have several symptoms that don't have that, aren't attributed to any of the diagnoses I do have, or are connected to the diagnoses I do have, but aren't part of it directly. It's called a comorbidity. And even if I had the diagnoses, that doesn't guarantee access to proper treatment. So I'm diagnosed as hypermobile, but I haven't had access to a physical therapist who knows what hypermobility is and regularly remembers that I'm hypermobile and that we have to modify my physical therapy.
Hmm.
I can't get access to a neuropsych consult for getting after getting hit by a car. I couldn't get access to a neurologist because supposedly local neurologists weren't taking TBI patients. They were not taking brain injury patients. That sounds so backwards. Um,
I know
and
what they
so
do.
and that was after like someone diagnosed me with a TBI, but I couldn't get the neuropsych consult to help establish what areas to target. so that I can go to neuropsych physical therapy
Hmm.
or neuropsych therapy. So there's the medical model. Our disabilities and our symptoms are what disable us. And then there's a social model.
Hmm.
Social model of disability is our diagnoses or symptoms are not what disable us. Society refusing to accommodate is what disables us. So, for example, I have a sticker that says cure ableism, not autism. Because my autism isn't the problem. It's a society that refuses to accommodate neurodivergent ways of thinking.
Hmm.
Um, I can't think of other examples of the social model right now, but do you want to respond to either of those?
I mean, I can see why a lot of people would immediately gravitate towards the medical model and say, well, yes, there's a symptom and there's a diagnosis, and, it, facts are facts, right? Like it seems very scientific and straightforward. But there are problems with that model, as you pointed out, in that, like, not everybody is able to get a diagnosis. And the thing that really sticks out for me with it is the idea that disability is mitigated by treatment of those diagnoses or symptoms. Okay, so if someone has, for instance, I don't know, ADHD, and we consider that a disability, even if it's being treated, that doesn't change the fact that they have it, and it doesn't change the fact that it creates a significant impact on their life, sometimes because of the treatment itself, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing that occurs to me, like, oh, you're not disabled, you can walk. Well, right. And I know a guy who literally is missing like the bottom third of his right leg. Like his leg was amputated about 4 inches below his knee. And even before he had a prosthetic, he could walk because he would not accept not being able to walk. Like, I mean, he literally would find a way to, strap a piece of 2x4 on the end of his stump and, hobble himself through the grocery store rather than ask for help because, and he'll admit he's insanely stubborn and nobody should do it the way that he does it. And, it actually created some complications for his eventual prosthetic because he had kind of screwed up the end uh, of the stump. But like somebody who's able to walk the way my buddy Jeff can walk because he's literally holding a piece of 2x4 to his leg to hobble through the grocery store. Like, yeah, there are people doing that with all kinds of disabilities, right? There are people who are doing that in invisible ways with things like chronic pain disorders. There are people who are doing that with invisible things like neurodivergence, who they're doing the equivalent of, hobbling through the grocery store because that's the only way they can survive because they're not able to get the diagnosis that they deserve and the treatment that they need.
Yeah. So I want to plug a book again. I keep plugging this Against Techno-Ableism by Ashley Shue. And she talks about like these tropes of disability that we see in media and people who do things like, I'm going to overcome, I'm going to get through this disability. The only disability is a bad attitude. And I'm going to use a 2x4 to walk. They might be seen as like inspirational overcomers,
Right.
right? And it's not to say it's a bad thing for them to navigate their disability that way, because whatever we have to do to get through is pretty much reasonable as long as we're not hurting other people. But there are so many invisible disabilities that people don't consider disability. Right now, my entire body feels like a bruise because of the air pressure. And really, I want to crawl into bed and not be
Mhm.
recording an episode. And at the same time, I love recording and I don't want to lose out on that.
Right.
Or the fact that I was in therapy earlier and I'm like, I feel broken constantly. I feel like my mind is broken and my body is broken and it's exhausting. And I'm tired of the things that I can't do that I want to be able to do.
Hmm.
I want to be able to walk my dog. And there are people who say, like, well, if you can't walk your dog, why do you have a dog? Well, one, I could walk my dog when I got my dog. And then I've been in like three car accidents since then, including one that knocked me from walking 2 miles at a time with a mobility aid to not being able to walk the length of my 30-foot trailer. So like, yeah. But also, my dog gets me out of bed in the morning. He's a
Hmm.
reason to get up, to have a schedule, to be able to do things. And maybe I can't walk my dog, but I can take my dog to the dog park on a good day. On a bad day, I can ask someone else to walk my dog if that's something that I can accommodate for. But invisible disabilities don't disappear because we no longer have them. It's a lot of the time it's because we're hiding them.
Hmm.
And for
We're learning how to mask them to the point that we can get by.
yeah, and one of the one of the things I think about is if I wasn't masking my pain, people wouldn't believe me about the level of pain I was in. And chronic pain patients often, like what might be a non-chronic pain person's eight is my three on a 1 to 10
Hmm.
pain scale. The pain scale is all sorts of messed up. But it also impacts my ability to mask, impacts like, am I masking my autism or my pain or my brain injury or all of the above? Do I have the energy to mask today? And if I can't mask today, am I going to go out and be in the world? Because quite frankly, if I'm not masking, I can be a little bit of a lot. I'm trying to avoid cussing folks because masking, not my communication style, but masking.
You can
Um,
be a little extra,
I
says
can
the
do a
guy
lot.
who is a lot extra. So yeah.
Yeah. And that's not to say my disability is a burden on others. It's to say that I don't want to put people through, and I've been taught that I should not put people through me being in a bad mood because I'm in pain.
Hmm.
And being in pain does not give me an excuse to be mean to people.
Right.
But it might make me a little shorter when people say things like, well, have you tried losing weight? Um, yeah. Do you want to add anything before I move on to spoon theory?
No, because I love spoon theory.
Okay. So, spoon theory. eh, In 2003, writer Christine Miserandino wrote on her blog, But You Don't Look Sick, about explaining chronic illness to her friend. And in her explanation, she used spoons as a metaphorical currency for energy and navigating disability. So if everyone starts off with a budget of spoons, and let's be generous and say everyone starts off with 10 spoons, each activity takes a spoon or a different amount of spoons. So if you don't have enough spoons, you don't get to do the task or the activity. But the reality is, we don't all start with the same number of spoons. Um, and dynamic disabilities are disabilities that shift, like where you're at from day to day, how they're impacting you from day to day. They, you have different numbers every day, right? So, say today I start with 10 spoons, but for me, taking a shower might take 3 spoons. So, if I get up and take a shower, and make and eat breakfast if each of those takes 1 spoon, I'm down 5 spoons and I only have 10 for the day. So, spoon theory is basically a metaphorical energy and kind of a metaphorical currency or money for navigating things like disability.
Hmm.
Spoonies are those of us with chronic illness and or pain or etc. that navigate the world according to how many spoons we have or don't have. Accommodations are ways to use fewer spoons or maximize spoon efficiency. But again, we don't all always have the option to use accommodations. Sometimes we have been told accommodations are available, but they're actually not. So the number of times I've booked a hotel and asked for a walk-in shower because on a travel day, I cannot get my leg into like up into a bathtub. And I get there and it's not like I was promised a disabled accessible room and it's not one. Things like that, or you get to a shop or a store and it's supposed to be accessible, but it doesn't have a ramp, or its aisles are too narrow to like let you in, or maybe their elevator, they have one, but you need to make a phone call and get like 3 people to come and let you use that elevator. These are real things that I've dealt with. And there are so many that I can't even fathom because I don't know all of the accommodations for all different disabilities, right? Um, Sometimes we choose not to use them because we feel we are judged for doing so, or we are actively judged for doing so. Sometimes we use them and face repercussions for doing so, not because we did something wrong, but because others take offense. So when I did my comprehensive exams, I had disability accommodations in place. So instead of writing for 3 days, taking 1 day off, writing for 3 days, 1 day off, writing for 3 days, I wrote for 5 days, 3 days off, 5 days, 3 days off, 5 days, 3 days off to accommodate my ADHD, my brain injury, and my chronic pain. And there were folks who were like, that's not fair. And they were salty about me using an accommodation and tried to say that my exams weren't valid. And we won't comment on how those exams are done, our hazing ritual to begin with.
Hmm.
But they're worse so for folks who are marginalized in one way or another, or who have kids or whatever. And then sometimes we are just blatantly denied accommodations, even though we're told we should have them.
Hmm.
Or we're asked things like, are you sure you need that? Are you sure you want to use that? In such a way that you know if you use that, you will be judged or not rehired or potentially let go at the end of something, etc. So, you said you love spoon theory. Do you care to share why?
It was an aha moment for me in terms of being able to just frame my own thinking about why something can be really easy for me one day and like climbing Mount Everest another day. Particularly as somebody who was diagnosed pretty late with ADHD. I wasn't diagnosed until I was 48. And when I was diagnosed, the guy who did my diagnosis said, oftentimes I'll like say things like indicates or may indicate in your kid. No, there's no indicates. You're like off the charts, dude. I don't know how you function, but and the reality is I had learned how to mask and I had learned how to self accommodate in a lot of ways. But one of the things that I had noticed but had never like been able to like articulate, and that my wife had in particular had noticed, was that certain cognitive functions might be very easy for me to do on a given day, And the next day or a different day might be very difficult and very frustrating, etc. And she was actually the one who pointed out to me, "Hey, if you don't have the spoons for this, that's fine." And I'm like, what are you talking about spoons?" Right? And she then explained spoon theory to me, and I'm like, "Holy crap, that makes so much sense." Because, if it's 9 o'clock in the morning and I had a pretty decent night's sleep, yeah, I can probably sit down with you and think through like our next, 6 months worth of priorities around the house. If it's Thursday afternoon and I'm coming off of a 5-day work week where I've already put in 60 hours and I'm completely wiped, that's not the time to ask me to do any of that kind of critical thinking. Not because I don't want to or because I don't think it's important, but because my brain literally can't make those connections right now.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I remember I was in a performance of social issues class, and we had to perform part of our identity. And I went to kind of the student union thing, and I grabbed a bunch of plastic spoons. And at that point, my asthma was really bad and actively affecting what I could do, especially in the winter in Iowa. Like I'd go outside and I'd cough so hard from my asthma that I'd throw up,
mhm,
right? And so I was trying to figure out how to explain this spoon theory and being a spoonie. And so I literally went and grabbed a bunch of spoons and I just sort of like walked through my tasks. I think I walked through that particular assignment and the spoons it took to do that particular assignment. And we need to remember that there's an emotional labor to navigating all of this
mhm,
and to teaching others about it. And we hear things, but you don't look sick, or but you mask so like you perform so well. And the reality is it's we mask so well.
mhm,
Um, we hear things like, but you don't look sick, and it's common to with people who have invisible disabilities. And the reality is most of our bodies are on the inside where you can't see them.
mhm.
All of my brains are inside my head where you can't see it. Um,
And most of us are grateful for that.
I mean, you should be like metaphorically and literally, like that they need to be in there.
I'm just talking in a very literal sense. Yes.
But when I get looked at weird because I'm using disabled parking,
Mhm,
you can't see the fact that I went into the store fine, and by the time I went to get back to my car, I could barely move get my bad leg into my seat because it hurt so much. I literally had to change my vehicle and get a lower vehicle because I could no longer get in and out of my little SUV thing. And people don't take things like that into consideration. They don't take the invisible to others, but definitely not to us costs of being disabled
mhm,
into consideration. They think about things like medication, but do they think about things like, okay, I can't walk to work and I'm not on a bus line, so I have to have a vehicle?
mhm. An example of this that is very trenchant for me right at the moment. So I was diagnosed about a year ago with rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune disorder, which causes excruciating pain in one's joints and connective tissues. And I've been on treatment for it, and my RA is pretty well managed most of the time. And occasionally I will have a pain flare up where it's just really it kind of sucks to be me for a couple of days from a pain standpoint. And that's all fine. Like I that's not the hard part. the hard part is days like where I'm at right now, which is I'm recovering from my first real illness, my first significant illness since I was put on this immunosuppressant therapy that keeps my RA from killing me. Because what happens is my immune system is attacking my own body. That's what causes
Yeah.
the RA flare-ups. So they put me on this medication that like lowers my immune response, which is great until you get a sinus infection. And I've had sinus problems my whole life. I've had sinus infections off and on my whole life. And I'm accustomed to a sort of trajectory where I start feeling cruddy one day. The next 2 days, I'm sort of actively sick and hating life. And by the third day, I'm starting to feel better and, I'm on the mend and able to function again. This is the first one I've had since I started the immunosuppressant therapy, and I am currently coming to the end of day 7 and feel like I'm on day 1.5.
Yeah.
And that's I've been on antibiotics for 5 days now, you know, and like nobody is going to recognize that the fact that I've basically been out of work sick all week is because of a chronic illness called rheumatoid arthritis. It's not the sinus infection. You know,
Yeah.
if a sinus infection did to me what a sinus infection used to do to me when my immune system was still functioning normally, I would have been back at work on Tuesday. I might not have missed a single day of work.
I mean, I feel this deeply and personally, and you know that because since COVID hit, I've been hesitant about a lot of things, teaching in person, hanging around small children, etc. Because I knew that my immune system doesn't like me very much
Mm-hmm.
and that a common cold could turn into something much worse. Last year, what would have been a common cold turned into acute respiratory failure and 6 days in the hospital on high flow oxygen, which was terrifying for me because they're asking me about, like, everyone's masked up, but no one's telling me why. And they're asking me, have I ever been intubated?
Right.
And so there's that. And then there was the emotional labor of being in the hospital. And someone asked me what I did. And I'm like, oh, I teach gender and sexuality. And they went on a rant about how we shouldn't teach that stuff to kids. And I had to manage their emotions about this topic while sick. And I also felt like I had to turn in my grades because I hadn't heard back from my boss yet, and it was the end of the semester.
Mm-hmm.
And so I deeply and personally feel the immunocompromised status that we don't think about until we have to think about it. And other people don't think about until someone they love is in the hospital or someone they love isn't recovering from a sinus infection or etc. A lot of the point of this episode is we're disabled. Feel bad for us because we don't want people to pity us.
Right.
We want you to be aware that there's a lot happening behind the scenes of disability. And we've said this multiple times across the podcast. Empathy and human kindness is incredibly important.
Mm-hmm.
It's not the disability Olympics. We're not comparing disabilities or struggles. A lot of neurodivergent folks have a habit of, or have a thing where you say something that's happened to you and I say a relatable story because that's how my brain
That's
relates.
how we bond,
And
right?
people don't consider that. So the reality is, we're not trying to compare disabilities or struggles because hard is hard.
Mm-hmm.
If things are hard for you because of RA and hard for me because of a TBI, they're different kinds of hard, but hard is hard.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if you're questioning if you're impacted enough by your symptoms or diagnoses to call yourself disabled, Abled people don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the other reality, and we've talked about this before too, is that the disabled community is beautiful, but it shouldn't have to exist. It exists because we need it and we've had to fight for things. And yet, I cannot imagine my life without it. Disability is complicated and messy. And it's going to be because we all experience it differently in our own bodies and in our own lives and in relation to the people we care about. We don't want there to be something wrong, but we do want answers to our symptoms. We want to be heard and taken seriously.
Right.
One of our more recent episodes, I had said that size is not an indicator of health, health is not an indicator of value. And people decided that was an excuse to attack my weight, which they didn't realize was negatively impacting my disabilities. And it's, again, empathy. And if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it. And at the same time, don't do things like touch other people's wheelchairs.
Mm-hmm.
Don't do things like assume you know what we need for help and just do it. Ask. Ask what kind of accommodation would be beneficial.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that disabled people are human. And if you've met one disabled person, you've met one disabled person.
Right. Because what's hard for one person with ADHD may not be what's hard for another person with ADHD. What's hard for one person with a traumatic brain injury may not be what's hard for another person with a TBI. And what's hard for one person with RA may not be what's hard for another person with RA. Like any of these different conditions or disabilities or whatever, everybody's experience of it is different. And again, as you said, compassion, empathy, and kind curiosity go a really long way. You
Yeah.
know, how can I best help you? How can I, how can I, best accompany you so that I'm not making your life actively harder, you know?
Yeah. And this isn't just conversations between abled people and disabled people. This is conversations between disabled people.
Mm-hmm.
Like at one point, you and I had to have a conversation about how you could support me. You asked that question. And I had to say, well, don't ask me the open ended question because open ended questions make things really hard. So, me and one of my friends and her husband, all three of us are friends actually. One of the things that we do is David will pick, like, have me pick 5 different places we could go to eat. Kirsten will narrow that down to 3 because we know, okay, of the 5 different places I can eat, 3 different places she can eat, and he picks the final one because picking is too hard because of our neurodivergences, but also like how we were socialized. We have a fear of picking wrong. Even if there's not a wrong answer, we have a fear of picking wrong. And it's this really, it took us a while to figure out the accommodation, but it was an accommodation we could do, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's a conversation that we've had of you were trained to ask open-ended questions
Right. Like all of my professional training is ask open-ended questions so that, they can then go with it where they need to go. And you're like, no, stop doing that to me.
because it makes me panic.
Right.
And for other people, that may be a very useful accommodation to be asked open-ended questions. But for me, I panic. Am I going to say something wrong? Is that not really what they wanted me to answer? Like if you ask me, how are you? I am the flavor of autism or of autistic that I really don't know if you want to know how I am or you want the social script that I've been taught and am, quote, supposed to use, even though it's
Right.
not the truth. And with
Right.
you, I know the answer to that, but I don't know that answer for other people.
Right.
That's why I say things like, instead of asking, how are you? I hope this finds you well. Um, yeah. Do you have anything before we move into put it into practice?
Nope. Nope. I'm
Okay.
good.
I was writing down the timestamp. So for this week's put it into practice, I didn't finish writing it out. I'm going to try to articulate this. There is a habit of explaining disability by saying, well, just pretend to be blind for a day. That doesn't give you an accurate picture of people's experiences who can't see. So, what we'd like you to do is consider the planning it takes to navigate life with a specific disability. We don't want you to pretend to have that disability. So, you're not a wheelchair user for the day, but imagine all of the considerations you would have to take if you were one. Consider what accommodations you might need to have if you had that specific disability. And if you don't know, look that up because that's something disabled people have to do as well.
Hmm.
And try to figure out if you had this disability, what are the barriers you'd have to face in your community? So, as someone who uses crutches, one of the things that I look for in like if I'm looking at where I'm going is, are there a lot of stairs? Well, if there are a lot of stairs, that's not something I can do. Is there a lot of walking? Okay, there's a lot of walking and I can sort of do the walking, but only if there are places I can sit, right? So look at those things and go from first thing in the morning, say, do it for like 4 hours. The first 4 hours of your day, what accommodations would you need? And tell us, do you think you could manage it? I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. And this goes to show that we're not perfect here on the podcast either, right? When you come across barriers you can't get through, what would you have to do to self advocate? Do you feel like you are able to do that self advocation? Do you feel like you are able to self accommodate? Or do you need others to help you in order to accommodate what whatever you're going through?
Or are there barriers that you encounter that you just have no idea how you would get around, through, over, past?
And you don't get to just not do the thing because there's a barrier. You need to figure out what would you do to accommodate that. So if you need to take the bus somewhere, but you don't know if the bus station is accessible, then you need to look up where is the nearest accessible bus location
Hmm.
and take these things into consideration as you are moving through your actual everyday lives. We don't get to decide if and when we become disabled. We do get to decide if that's the language we use to describe ourselves. And for some of us, the moment we're able to say, I'm disabled, makes us feel seen. It's also a moment of grief because, as we said in a recent episode on joy, when we experience this moment of we have an answer, like we have a diagnosis and that gives us an answer, but we have to grieve what we lose when we do that. We also get to celebrate what we gain, things like community and understanding of our own experiences. Um, if you are disabled yourself, we encourage you to modify this assignment into whatever. you think would be most helpful. As always, leave it in the comments. Leave us your questions, your thoughts, because your engagement means a lot to us here. We want this to be a podcast that helps other people. And if you feel like we missed something, we want you to say it because that helps us the next time we talk about this topic. I am going to I plugged Ashley's book, but this also, The Demystifying Disability. You can tell I'm an academic because my books all have lots of stickies. Um, but I recommend these books as a way to start your journey in understanding disability and being a disability ally. So if you can, check them out. Check if your local library has them. Support disabled authors and creators of all kinds, because quite frankly, disabled folks need your support. Marginalized folks need your support, and we can support each other. Um, do you have anything else before we go?
Just my usual reminder to folks to remember that they are, in fact, deeply and profoundly loved.
You definitely are, folks. And this is a reminder that you are important and to take care of yourself because you're too important not to. We appreciate you. Until next time on the Farming Practice Podcast, take care. Bye.
I
Mm.